Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Butterfield, Director of the John W. Kluge Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Library of Congress here at the Jefferson Building, where we'll in a moment be joined by Alicia Chipman, recently a staff fellow in the Kluge Center and senior photograph conservator at the library. And this will be an interesting discussion of the history and preservation of photomechanical prints. I have nothing more of substance to say about photomechanical prints, but I know that Alicia does. I do want to speak briefly about the staff fellowship because what happened here to bring in Alicia to work on this project for 6 months is a signature program that's been a part of the Kluge Center since its founding some 25 years ago. This fellowship gives Library of Congress staff an opportunity to take their expertise, their immense knowledge of the collections, to pursue their own research project while on detail away from their usual duties, and to do great work of the sort we're about to hear about today. It's just 6 months, it goes by quickly, but it's one of the very best things that the Kluge Center does. For any library staff out there, applications are open for these fellowships, closing on April 30th, and this is an annual thing that the Kluge Center, through that generous gift that created the Kluge Center in the year 2000, is able to provide annually for Library of Congress staff, but really for the broader pursuit of knowledge. It's an opportunity for some of the most knowledgeable, experienced, and qualified people to take a short detail away from their daily work and dive deep. It's been such a pleasure having Alicia Chipman at the Kluge Center. I'm excited for her to share her work with you. There are going to be great opportunities for you to ask questions momentarily. Please join me in welcoming Alicia Chipman.
Hello, thank you, Kevin. And in 45 minutes, I hope you have a lot to say about photomechanical prints. I'll check back in when I'm done. I'd like to start with thanking all of the staff of the Kluge Center for this wonderful opportunity to share my research today, and also for the 6-month staff fellowship to develop this work that I'll talk about today. I must also thank all of my fellow fellows. I think some of them may be online, and they've really made this experience at the center so enriching and fun for me. Of course, my time spent at the Kluge Center was incredibly significant to my research, but it was also inspiring for me to step out of my day-to-day routine, meet new people, and hear about fascinating research in fields I know very little about. After the Kluge, I took a short leave of absence from the library last fall to spend 3 months as a museum guest scholar at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. And some of the work I'll be presenting today came out of that time there, so I'd like to take a moment to thank Sarah Freeman and everyone in the Paper Conservation Department for making this incredible opportunity available to me. And of course, thank you to my fellow guest scholars, which are pictured here. I miss all of you and the Pink Palace terribly. Thank you for a really beautiful experience. So during my fellowships at the Kluge and the Getty, my research has been focused on the long-term objective of writing a book. Photomechanical prints, history, identification, and care. And I'm very happy to share that this will be a Getty publication, and it's planned for release in 2030. This book will align in scope and design with these 3 previous Getty publications that are considered essential reading for anyone interested in the technical history and materiality of photographic materials. The goal of my book is to provide an entry-level reference on the history and evolution of the materials and processes of photomechanical printmaking. It will consider why these prints were created, how they were used, and it will give guidance for how to identify and care for them as well. And the publication will be available in print format for a cost, but it will also be available online for free for anyone that needs this kind of information. So today I'd like to share a little bit about what a photomechanical print is, why they're important, and why I think this book is needed. So let's start with considering what is a photomechanical print. So this is the definition from the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. Photomechanical prints are images produced by processes that involve a photographic process, which employs light sensitivity, to transfer an image, and then a separate process to produce the print, which was never itself light sensitive. So along the bottom of the slide here, you can see examples of some materials that I made in a photogravure workshop. So this is an image I took of the Acropolis in Athens, and I started by acquiring a digital image that was then printed on a transparency film using an inkjet printer. However, historically, this probably would have been a glass plate or a film-based negative or transparency. Then, depending on the process, you somehow transfer that image to a printing plate or a matrix, and from that you can make mini prints. Photomechanical prints are hybrids of photography and traditional printmaking. They are produced using light-sensitive materials and complex photographic processes, but the finished product, like a traditional print, is usually quite simple, simply consisting of ink on paper. This new hybrid form of printing combined the accuracy of photographic image capture with the strengths of printmaking. And as a result, photomechanical prints realized many desires where early chemical photography had disappointed, including practical and economical methods for mass circulation of images, techniques to facilitate the simultaneous printing of image and text, and increased permanence. Chemical photography, especially in its earliest days, was plagued with many problems, including image instability, an inability to easily be used for book illustrations since photographs usually had to be tipped in separately, and inconsistent results, because it was actually pretty challenging and very expensive to create a large set of matching prints. So now I'll give a brief background into printmaking before I go on to focus on the photomechanical processes. The manufacture of printing plates falls into three main categories, which distinguish how the image was created on the plate. With manual techniques, such as carving, incising, or drawing, with mechanical means, such as the use of the tracing arm device you can see here, or photomechanically, which, as I explained, employs light-sensitive materials. Now, in reality, a printer could actually use all three methods to make just one printing plate. And today, I'll give a few examples of both manual and photomechanical techniques. Manual printmaking is a creative process based on the creation of a printing surface that's inked and used to make multiple nearly identical impressions onto a receiving support. So a printing surface can be anything, actually. Some people even use a potato or a fish. But typically, they're plates or blocks that are made out of wood, metal, stone, or plastic. And the print support is commonly paper, but it could just as easily be a textile, ceramic, plaster, or many other materials. And the example you see here on the left is a Chinese wood block and a print that was pulled from it. Now, woodblock printing was invented in China around the year 700. To further increase the speed and efficiency of printing text, the next step was the invention of movable type, wherein individual characters could be used multiple times in different arrangements, rather than carving an entire script into one single wood block. And these are some examples of early Korean movable type that are in the Library of Congress's collections. The world's oldest extant book made with movable type was printed in Korea about 77 years prior to Johannes Gutenberg's Bible, which was printed in Mainz, Germany around 1455. However, the printing of Gutenberg's Bible is often cited as the invention of printing in the West, and it certainly did have a profound effect on the dissemination of knowledge and art. And as you can see in this 19th century reenactment, Gutenberg's studio was rather small and simple, just a printer, a few assistants, and a press. But in contrast, you can see in this example of a print shop at the turn of the century what printing became: a large-scale industrial practice that filled our world with text and images. There are many ways to manually make a print, but all the processes fall into these four general categories: relief, intaglio, planographic, and stencil. These categories refer to how the printing plate is made and how the ink is transferred from the plate to the print. For relief processes, the image area you want to print is raised from the rest of the printing plate. Relief matrices can be created by removing the recessed non-printing elements of the design through carving or etching, or in an opposite fashion, you could also build up the image elements through casting, forming, or attaching. Once inked, the image is transferred under pressure to the printing surface. Now, with intaglio processes, it's actually the opposite. The areas to be printed are removed from the plate, commonly through methods of incising or etching, and the ink sits in these grooves. Ink is then transferred from the recessed areas under significant pressure, usually involving the use of an etching press. Planographic processes use a printing plate with a flat surface. So in this case, the image and non-image areas are on the same plane. However, the surface has been treated so that the image areas are oil-loving, so they accept the ink, whereas the non-image areas are water-loving, so they repel ink. And one method for making a lithograph is to draw directly onto a polished slab of limestone using an oil-based lithographic crayon or ink. With stencil processes such as screen printing, an image is created by forcing ink or paint through openings or voids in a fine porous screen, and a resist then blocks up the pores of the screen in the non-image areas. So with this understanding of manual printmaking, I'll now shift to a discussion of photography and then on to photomechanical printing. When photography was introduced in the mid-19th century by multiple inventors, including Niepce, Florence, Talbot, and Daguerre, it was immediately put into comparison with other forms of graphic and fine arts. The medium was enthusiastically embraced by the public at large for its ability to capture images with accuracy and detail without the interference of the artist's hand. And some, like Talbot, even used the term pencil of nature to emphasize the supposedly objective nature of this new art, which allowed light itself to become the painter. The history of photography can be told as an evolution of advancing technology, but it's also a story of experimentation and interrogation, which is easily observed through the development of photomechanical printing. Photographers, historians, and critics have spent decades now debating the nature, function, and purpose of photography. Is it a science or is it an art? Creation or reproduction? Truth, manipulation? Is it original or facsimile? This object is widely considered to be the first photograph. It's a heliograph created by Nicephore Niepce in 1827. Using bitumen coated on a pewter plate, Niepce captured the first permanent image of a natural scene with the aid of a camera obscura. Now, Niepce's experimentations were inspired by the recently introduced practice of lithography, and his work actually began in hopes of developing a photographically produced printing plate. Some even argue that this very object was intended to be etched. And here are a few prints that are even earlier. Now, for these, instead of using a camera, these prints were created by placing engravings in contact with photosensitized materials on metal, and those metal pieces were then etched and used as printing plates, and these prints are the results. So you see that actually the earliest photography was in fact photomechanical printmaking. And this is a print made by Hercule Florence in 1833. A contemporary of Niepce, Florence was independently inspired to use chemistry and sunlight to make copies of text and graphic documents. What you see here is actually a photographic copy of a printed pharmacy label. As a French immigrant living in Brazil, Florence found his access to printmaking materials limited due to his location, his lack of financial means, and some political restrictions. So his experiments were actually inspired by his desire to make printing available to everyone. Other practitioners like Hippolyte Fizeau were experimenting with the daguerreotype process introduced by Niepce's business partner, Daguerre. They searched for ways to transform the daguerreotype itself into an etched printing plate. So the daguerreotype was a unique, one-of-a-kind object that exhibited unrivaled image quality, and it was created on a copper plate in the camera, hence an obvious choice for photomechanical experimentation. Like printmaking, many photographic processes possess a serial nature, relying on the production of a negative to produce multiple duplicate prints. This is an image of William Henry Fox Talbot's printing facility in Reading, England, the first of its kind. Talbot's salted paper print process promised the ability for widespread distribution of large editions of photographic prints, so like manual printmaking, but even better, because it was considered more accurate and objective in nature. So in this image, you can see Talbot himself operating the camera at the center, along with his business partner, Nicholas Henneman, operating the camera at the right. And you can see other employees are shown copying engravings and also inspecting racks of mini glass printing frames that are undergoing exposure. I find it fascinating that right from the beginning, inventors explored the abilities of photography as an implement, supplement, or replacement to printmaking. I acknowledge that sometimes they experimented with copying engravings merely because it was technically easier to do so, especially in the earliest stages of invention. However, in several instances, it was seen as an independent and important goal of this medium. In Talbot's illustrated treatise, The Pencil of Nature, he included reproductive images of engravings and printed pages of text and predicted that this would be a beneficial use of photography for the historian and the antiquarian. Indeed, the field of art history was made possible through reproductions supplied by printmaking, photography, and ultimately photomechanical printing. These images are from the first book on art history that was illustrated with photographs. Talbot-type illustrations to the Annals of the Artists of Spain was published in 1847 with salted paper prints that were made by Henneman at Talbot's Reading establishment. And the training of art historians would never be the same. The intention was to include precise, inexpensive illustrations. However, there were many technical difficulties in achieving this goal, and the outcome really fell short. Upon completion, the prints varied considerably in tone from print to print, and many of the prints actually deteriorated immediately, resulting in these very faded, useless images. And actually, this was not an unusual occurrence in the early days of chemical photography. Chemical photography is based on the light sensitivity of certain photosensitive materials that undergo a chemical reaction in proportion to the amount of light that they absorb. There are several photosensitive substances that are used for photography, but the most widely used is the conversion of silver halides to metallic silver. And you can see in this example, there's a bottle of white, unexposed silver halide crystals that was then covered by a paper mask that had an image cut out, and it was exposed to light. So darkened black metallic silver has formed where the paper mask allowed the light exposure to penetrate. This is essentially the same process used for printed out silver photographic processes such as salted paper and albumin prints. And in other processes, a latent image is formed in this manner, but then followed with further chemical development in a darkroom, such as with silver gelatin developed out prints. In the 1840s, the rapid fading of photochemical prints made with silver halide chemistry threatened to completely discredit photography on paper. So in 1855, the Photographic Society of London appointed a committee of chemists and photographers to conduct a scientific investigation of the problem. The Fading Committee, as it was popularly known, was sponsored with funding from the avid and influential photography enthusiast Prince Albert. In the end, they actually reported that there were many possible reasons for a photograph to deteriorate, including poor processing, exposure to unstable environments or pollutants, as well as poor choices in adhesives, enclosures, or mounting papers. So it's no wonder that early photographic innovators were interested in translating the photographic image to the printing plate as a way to produce a permanent photographic image with ink on paper. They wanted to avoid situations like this one. This is a publication of an expedition of the French explorer Pierre Tremont. It was originally published with salted paper prints. Then, once it was observed that they quickly deteriorated, Tremont quickly supplied his subscribers with an apology, as well as replacement lithographic illustrations. So what you see here is a lithograph that was pasted over a faded salted paper print. Talbot's disappointments with his salted paper prints' lack of reliable permanence led him to experiment with photomechanical processes as well, inventing what he called photoglyphic engraving, which is actually an early precursor to what we now identify as photogravure. I think you can see both his frustrations and his intentions exemplified in this object on the left. It's a photoglyphic engraving of an albumin carte de visite portrait. So here he's making a more permanent copy of an inherently unstable chemical photographic process. And the image on the right shows Talbot's experiments with fabric. In 1852, Talbot filed a patent for use of woven mesh fabrics that could be placed between the negative and the printing plate during exposure in order to break the image up into a series of dots. And this is, in fact, the first use of a halftone screen. And I'll explain more on the halftone screen concept in just a moment. Collectors, scientists, and others wanted to see photomechanical printmaking succeed as well. To up the ante a bit, the Duc de Luynes, an archaeologist and an avid supporter of the arts, sponsored a competition in 1856 with a monetary prize of 8,000 francs awarded to the creator of an efficient photomechanical printing process. The competition generated international interest and finally concluded in 1867 with the top award going to Louis-Alphonse Poitevin for his photolithographic process, which is seen here. Second place was awarded to Charles Negre for his photogravure process, and I'll show some examples and talk about that in a bit. Poitevin and Negre used an important material that was critical to the success of photomechanical printing, dichromates. This is a light-sensitive material that is most often employed in photomechanical processes. All chromates and dichromates, including ammonium, potassium, and sodium dichromate salts, when added to an organic colloid such as gelatin, albumin, fish glue, or gum arabic, will produce a photosensitive layer that hardens through the action of light. After exposure, the object is washed in water, and only the exposed hardened areas remain intact. And this creates a relief that corresponds to the image that the layer was exposed under. The light exposure also results in changes to the colloid's reception to water, and both of these effects are actually used in printing processes. Gelatin dichromate was commercially manufactured from the 1870s until 2007 and is commonly referred to as carbon tissue or gravure pigment paper. So the photomechanical printing processes follow the same four categories that are used for manual printmaking, and the act of pulling a print from the plate is actually the same as I have previously described. However, there's an additional fifth category, which I'm calling cast, and this last category is unique to photomechanical printmaking. The basic premise is very similar to using a Jell-O mold. So for Woodbury type, the printer creates a mold of the photographic image using carbon tissue and a lead plate. And then pigmented gelatin is poured into this mold and placed under pressure while in contact with paper to create the cast image. For photomechanical processes, dichromates can be used in all of these print categories in order to transfer the image to the printing matrix. For example, an exposed gelatin dichromate layer can be used as a template, as in Woodbury type, as a printing surface for collotype, or as a resist in photogravure, letterpress halftone, and also in screen printing. One of the major challenges of photomechanical processes is translating the continuous tone images that are obtained with chemical photography to the practice of printmaking. As you can see on the right, a continuous tone image, like those produced with chemical photography, is one that can render a full range of tones, including all the shades of gray found between black and white. On the other hand, when creating a printing plate, the plate either has ink present or it does not. There's no gradation of tone, just paper or ink. However, to create the illusion of tone, a printmaker can create lines of varying thickness or apply a system of hatching with lines, dots, and dashes placed close together to create denser areas in the print that hold more ink. And the closer the marks are placed together, the darker those areas will appear, and this can actually give an impression of tonality. As printmakers searched for additional ways to introduce shades of gray and smoother tonal transitions into their prints, new techniques were developed like aquatint and mezzotint, which could mimic subtle tonal variations. The aquatint process uses a tonal etching technique that involves covering the printing plate with grains of resin, and mezzotint uses a tool called a rocker to roughen the surface of the copper plate. Both of these techniques introduce an overall texture or a pattern to the image, which helps the printmaker to create what we call halftone, which is gradation of tone. Some of the photomechanical processes, like collotype and photogravure, do something similar. In fact, photogravure is the photomechanical equivalent to aquatint and also employs the use of a resin grain. Collotype uses the natural reticulation of gelatin, which results in this worm-like pattern that you see. Other photomechanical processes rely on the use of a halftone screen. In fact, the word halftone has become synonymous with photomechanical printing due to the use of halftone screens in two of the most dominant processes. So maybe you came here today thinking that photomechanical printing all used halftone screen, but that's actually not true. The halftone screen conveniently converts a continuous tone image into one composed of small dots of varying size or frequency. And it works in the same way as these other methods. They all rely on the function of human eyesight to interpret dot patterns as continuous tone if they're seen from a distance. And also, I just want to point out that for all of the processes, the finer the screen or the grain, the better the illusion. So as you can see, even under magnification, this mezzotint and photogravure are very convincing because the grain is so fine. Whereas the others are rougher, so the dot patterns are obvious when you look under magnification. Typically, the halftone screen was a piece of glass with a cross-line pattern that was etched into it. A common method of creating a halftone negative was to place a halftone screen in a large process camera used to re-photograph the image desired. And this would create a new negative with a continuous tone image that's now broken up into halftone dots. And this was then used to create the printing matrix. Marrying the halftone screen with the printing paper was an art of compatibility. Generally, fine screens with more dots per inch required smoother papers. And a photomechanical printmaker always needed to keep the end result in mind, as it would determine their approach to printing as well as their choice of materials. There are numerous variations of photomechanical printing processes, and a majority of my research has been focused on learning about the materials and methods of the processes, as well as their evolution over time. And unfortunately, I don't have time today to go into any great deal of this aspect of my work. But this year, I'm focusing on preparing educational materials so that I can begin to teach intensive workshops on the technical history and process identification of photomechanical prints. And I hope to begin offering these workshops to library employees this fall, and then I'll open it up to colleagues in other institutions. So if you're interested, please let me know. I'm also working on creating a sample set of photomechanical prints. There's an established history of creating this type of resource in photograph conservation, and a few existing examples are pictured here. These sample sets typically consist of a number of prints depicting a single image or a test target made using different processes following historically accurate procedures and materials. And these sets are excellent teaching resources because it's actually really rare to be able to see the same image printed in different processes, and it helps a lot for people to fine-tune their observation skills. So as I build this sample set, I'm also hoping to get some hands-on experience and make videos of each of the process to be used for education. In 2022, my colleague Dana Hemingway and I were able to take a 5-day photogravure workshop taught by the master printer John Goodman. One of the highlights of my career is opportunities like this when I get my hands dirty and I get to learn by doing. And during this workshop, I was able to produce a video with the photographer Mark Katzman. So I'd like to show you this short video that fully elucidates the photogravure process so that you can leave here today at least feeling like you have an in-depth understanding of how at least one of the processes works.
Is exposed in contact with the film positive using an ultraviolet light source. When a sensitized carbon tissue is exposed to ultraviolet light, it hardens. When exposed through a film positive, the highlights of the image transmitting the most light harden most. The shadows transmitting the least amount of light harden the least. A piece of copper is prepared by polishing, cleaning, and degreasing. The exposed carbon tissue is laid down on the copper plate. The plate is then developed in a bath of warm water, which allows the tissue support to be removed. During development, the soft, unexposed gelatin is washed away, leaving varying thickness of exposed hardened gelatin corresponding to the image. Once developed, the plate is dried and prepared for etching. The plate is placed in a charged dusting box, allowing a fine dust of resin to fall on the plate. The dust, called an aquatint grain, acts as a resist during the etch, creating a fine, irregular network of pits that can hold ink. Then the plate is bathed in a sequence of solutions of ferric chloride, an acid that etches or eats away at the copper. The thinnest areas of hardened gelatin correspond to the darkest areas in the image and begin etching first. The highlights, protected by thicker gelatin, etch last. The result is a microscopic pattern of etched pits of varying depths capable of holding ink and corresponding to the original continuous tone image. Once etched, the remaining gelatin is removed using a solvent. The plate is given a final rinse and dried and is now ready for printing. A roller is used to gently spread ink across the face of the plate. The excess ink is gradually removed from the surface using a tarlatan rag. The remaining ink is skillfully removed with the surface of the hand. The edges are cleaned and the plate is printed in the traditional manner on dampened paper using an intaglio etching press. The pressure of the press produces an impression of the outer edges of the copper plate, known as a plate mark. Finally, the print is dried and flattened.
So now with the remainder of my time, I'd like to show some examples of photomechanical prints while highlighting some works I've been studying in the collections of the library and the Getty. Then I'll finish with a discussion of the issues and the goals of my research. The publication Excursion daguerréenne is a rare example of the commercial use of Fizeau's direct etch process, an adaptation of the daguerreotype image for use in the printing press. I hope you can see here just how spectacular these images are and imagine how impressed the public would have been to see these prints with all the detail of modern life captured. As you can see in these images, the prints display minute details of architecture and sometimes also unappealing elements such as trash and a busy intersection of horse-drawn carriages. Not every copy of this publication contains examples of the direct etch prints, as they were costly and very time-consuming to make. And most of the prints in the publication are actually aquatints that were made after a photograph. This means that daguerreotypes were used as a reference for the printmaker to create this hand-drawn scene. And as you can see, the perspective and accuracy of the photograph does translate to create a realistic effect, but the details show the gestures of an artist to simplify reality, including fantastical figures and excluding all the haphazard realities of real life. These are prints that were used for the illustration of scientific journals and reports. The supposed truthfulness of photography made it a perfect instrument for observation and recording of evidence in many scientific disciplines, including astronomy, archaeology, ethnography, geography, and medicine. And here's an example of a later Tremont publication. This one was printed using Poitevins' newly developed photolithographic process. As you may be able to see, the process was still pretty rough and it was grainy, but it was still employed nonetheless for its added air of authenticity to the project. And I find it fascinating to see that with this plate in particular, that despite the accuracy of the photograph, there was still a need to add a hand-drawn diagram in order to fully convey the detail of the documented inscription. And these are very early test prints of photogravures made by Charles Negre for the Duc de Luynes' publication of his archaeological exploration of the Dead Sea. As I hope you remember from earlier in this very presentation, the Duc de Luynes was the sponsor of a competition to develop a successful photomechanical printing process, and Charles Negre won second prize. And this project explains why. Negre used his process to create beautiful photogravure prints from flawed negatives that were not of his making, but were underexposed and lacked detail. So to accomplish this, he used hand-applied retouching, and this was the reason cited for his not receiving first prize in the competition, even though he was able to submit many other samples that showed that retouching was not always required with his process. So what you see here is an albumin print that was made from the negatives supplied to Negre, and it includes hand-drawn instructions for addition of clouds to the sky and also for modifications to make the landscape more legible. And this is a proof print with additions in red pencil indicating further areas of required reworking that were needed in the landscape. And this is another proof print that was near the final stage. And you can see that Negre expertly pulled out details in the negatives, or he actually created them where they were lacking in order to provide a clear, detailed landscape. And this is a finished print hanging in the bedroom of my good friend, the photogravure collector Mark Katzman. I couldn't believe my eyes when I visited him on my road trip back to DC from LA. I was excited to share news of what I had saw in Getty, and when I showed him these images, he walked me over and showed me this. So I'll just say it's really nice to have good friends that are equally interested in your really esoteric research. Negre and others, including Edouard Baldus, used photomechanical processes to expertly turn documentation of European architecture into images of pure beauty. And photographers in other locations were doing the same. Here are some examples in Colotype by Marc Ferrez, documenting the architecture of Rio de Janeiro. Photomechanical prints were also a reliable form of illustration for industrial reports and advertising of everything from lace to steam trains. They were regularly used for ephemera of tourism, including stereo views and postcards like those seen here, and other forms of ephemera, including these very cool and trippy posters commissioned by the rock concert promoter Bill Graham. Illustrations for literature are often in photomechanical form as well, sometimes by prominent artists, such as this example of Clarence White's photogravure illustrations for the novel Eben Holden, which was published in 1903. But perhaps no other field is so closely associated with photomechanical printmaking than journalism. Every newspaper, journal, and magazine was illustrated with these processes, and this industry alone drove innovation until digital photographic methods rose to dominance. I've already mentioned the indispensable connection between photomechanical prints and art history, and how these accurate, inexpensive fine art reproductions actually nourish the discipline. And in a moment, I'll also discuss how art reproductions sometimes limited and pigeonholed the reach of these processes. For example, when a photographer makes prints in a photomechanical process, are they inherently reproductions? Is a photogravure a reproduction of a platinum or a silver gelatin print? And in fact, are all photographs reproductions of a negative? And what if the photomechanical process was actually the ultimate aesthetic goal of the artist? And then what about artist books? Paul Strand's a great example to consider because for him, the art book was actually the final artistic creation of his work. Of course, there are many clear examples of photomechanical printmaking being utilized as a means of fine art, and this is just a few examples of contemporary artists that are still using the mediums. And also I want to point out that these processes are often used by artists not identified as photographers. And does that make a difference? In 2021, the National Gallery of Art's annual Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts were given by the art historian and Harvard University humanities professor Jennifer L. Roberts. The series, Contact Art and the Pull of Print, was also published in book format in May of last year. I find her work incredibly inspiring and thoughtful, and I was actually struck by her suggestion that the current disregard for photomechanical prints is due to their being obscured by a perceived technical barrier to comprehension and overlooked due to their ubiquity. It's true, photomechanical prints are abundant in libraries, archives, and museums worldwide, and I'm sure actually many of you use them regularly for your work, no matter what that work might be. Some of the prints are poor in quality and ephemeral in nature, but many are also profoundly beautiful. They're technically remarkable, and they've had profound influence over numerous disciplines. However, because the technology is complicated and the processes are hybrid in nature, photomechanical prints have often lived on the periphery of study in the fields of art history, of photography, and the graphic arts. So the ultimate goal of my work is actually to shift this perspective by providing the information needed to break down this technical barrier and shine a spotlight on photomechanical prints. From the beginning, reliable resources on the technical aspects of photomechanical printmaking have been lacking. As you can see here in Wilkinson's text from 1888, he explains, although the number increases almost every week, there are but few persons who understand photoreproductive processes in all their details. And those who do have been so chary of giving of what they know that our literature on the subject is very scant indeed. There are several 19th century manuals like this one, and thanks to my Kluge Fellowship and the very extensive holdings of the library, I spent a very large portion of my time reading many of these. It was a gift, but I have to say it's also pretty painful. Many of these resources are very difficult to follow. Sometimes they're just outright confusing on purpose. And that's because photomechanical printmaking was largely a commercial endeavor, and printmakers were known for being secretive in order to maintain a competitive advantage. Also, photomechanical printmakers tended to be very highly specialized, so there was a lot of room for confusion, mistranslation, and just outright false news regarding technical details in these publications. Another problem is that there is a real lack of modern resources that have condensed and made sense of the period literature. There are books like these that provide excellent information on the technical history and process identification of manual prints, and there are several equivalents that do the same for chemical photography. And some of these resources do contain information about photomechanical processes, but it's usually pretty short, and historically it's also been heavily biased. The resources that focus on printmaking don't go into much detail because they hold the belief that photomechanical works are true prints. And the resources that focus on photography basically do the same because they're not purely photographic either. Some of the opinions are so drastic that I actually find them rather comical. Here's an example from Felix Brunner's 1962 text where he explains, "It is one of the most important aims of this book to draw a careful dividing line between original graphic art and reproduction. It's gratifying to find that some circles of connoisseurs have accepted that photographic processes and original graphic art are incompatible. Photography can never produce works of art." Photomechanical processes were fundamentally seen as a threat to manual artistic printmaking, and their technical complexity was often turned against them as a confusing impurity that degraded their inherent artistic value. And this perspective that photomechanical materials aren't photographs, they aren't prints, they're not art, they're merely a practical commercial means of image reproduction has actually dominated the field for a long time. And I argue that it's much of the reason why we don't currently have sufficient resources, knowledge, or appreciation for these very complicated materials. Another major issue is what Sylvester Rosa Kuhler explains as the hideousness of the photomechanical nomenclature. There were tons of photomechanical processes, and they all had different names, many being named after the inventor, even though sometimes that new invention was really only very slightly different from others. And processes that are completely different have the same name, and other processes that are the same have different names. And frankly, there's just way too many names. This is such a strong barrier to entry because it makes it nearly impossible to communicate clearly about the materials because people can't even agree what they're looking at because everyone's calling it something different. And even though this observation was made by Kuhler in 1892, the situation really isn't that different today. This very busy and chaotic slide is actually meant to be overwhelming to illustrate the atrocious nature of the terminology. So this is just 3 of the major categories of print types: relief, intaglio, and planographic, along with only a selection of some of the names used to describe photomechanical processes within these respective categories. Now, some of these names do actually differentiate process variations within the category, and some are different names for the very same thing. But what I want to illustrate here is first just the overwhelming number of names, but also, as you can see with the color coding, that some names are confusingly very similar across completely different categories of print types. So for example, a mesotype, a mesotint photogravure, and a mesograph are completely different. Yet a heliogravure, a photogravure, and a photo engraving can actually be referring to the same thing. And this list doesn't even include a full listing of foreign language names. These are just names that are used in English literature. I'm spending a lot of my time gathering together a comprehensive list of terminology and creating a user-friendly guide to help translate this really big mess. Another major issue is being able to accurately identify a print's process. Some different processes can actually look very similar, like this example of an image by Alfred Stieglitz that was printed in photogravure, platinum, and carbon. Even with detailed looking by an expert who has access to magnification, these 3 processes can be notoriously difficult to distinguish. And for a novice, it's even more challenging, so prints are often misidentified. There are key characteristics to look for, but as you can see with these magnified images, it's not always easy to distinguish between a very fine-grained photogravure on the left here or a platinum print on the right. And this is just one example of an area of difficulty. So why does identification matter anyway? Well, the ability to accurately identify and understand a print's facture can inform and enhance research queries and contribute to our ultimate understanding of a print. Familiarity with the print's materiality is also critical to accurate description during an object's acquisition, cataloging, and use in either exhibition or educational initiatives. So for those of us that work in institutions, it's our duty to provide accurate information to the public about our collections. For researchers, the more accurate information you have, the better the result of your work. And thanks in part to the material turn in art history, it's now widely recognized that understanding a print's facture can actually provide new perspectives on its meaning, its significance, and its value. For conservators like me, this information is essential to our decision-making regarding conservation treatment and preservation projects. And it's also a critical factor in determining authenticity and dating. So for collectors, process identification can have a substantial effect on determining market value. And just for fun, I pulled these examples. So this is online auction results to show you. Here are some values for sales of platinum prints by Alfred Stieglitz that range from $250,000 to $300,000. And here, in comparison, are recent sales of photogravures by the same artist selling for about $15,000 to $30,000. So I recognize that these aren't perfect examples. They're not the same image. But you get the point, and I'm actually purposely being a little bit provocative here because I just want you to think about value and its relation to process and why. So thank you for your time. I'd like to thank everyone listed here for their assistance and their support over the past year. I had an incredible year in which I was able to devote my time and focus to pursuing this research, but also I just want to say I gained countless intangible strengths as well, and I sincerely hope that institutions like the Getty and the Kluge Center can continue this incredibly important work they do in supporting our intellectual and creative communities. And one last thing, just until my book comes out in 2030, I just want to point you in the direction of these really excellent resources that are available online, and also my contact information. If you have questions or suggestions, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. And that's all. So we have time for questions. If you're in the audience, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Oh, Susan, yeah, there's the microphone coming for you if you want to use that. Okay. You have to use the microphone.
Hi.
If I have to, you have to.
Hi, Alicia.
Hi.
I did not realize that rosin was used in these early photogravures. I thought they jumped right into the use of the different textiles. So how does the rosin know where to fall?
So there are many different ways that you can apply rosin, but one of the most, you actually saw in the video, is the most common. You have this big box with the rosin is in a powder form. Yes, exactly. And you kind of stir up the resin so that it's in a big cloud in the box. You wait until the big particles fall, and then you put the plate in, and the small, particles fall, and it creates this very organic pattern. That's typically how you do it. There are other.
But then when you are washing off everything, is there more rosin sticking to the non-hardened gelatin?
Yes, so the rosin and the hardened gelatin are on the plate at the same time. So they are both acting as resists, but for different reasons, but in compatible ways. So the rosin is actually giving you an organic pattern to, and actually on the video it kind of showed that if you didn't have the rosin, if you had an area that was all black, the ink would probably just wipe right out. But the resin kind of creates these channels to hold the ink. And it also is giving you this organic pattern that creates, the tonality. Whereas the hardened gelatin is corresponding to the image. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of.
Well, it's a similar process, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so you said that a mezzotint is more like a holotype? Did you say that, or did I?
No, I didn't say that. I'd have to think about that. No, I think the colotype is its own thing. I mean, colotype is a planographic process, and it's using the reticulation of gelatin to create that organic pattern that you're getting. So very different. There are some photomechanical processes that are specifically looking like mesograph, but I can't think of them right now.
Alicia, the next question is from the audience that's watching online.
Okay.
This is the question. With the many terms used for this process, is your project making the case for the use of one or more of them, and why?
Yes, so there actually is established vocabulary, and that does function very well. However, I think where the confusion is that there are many different names, like I showed in the slide, and sometimes these names are being used in literature or even on the print itself, and it can be very confusing to know how that filters up to the overarching agreed upon name. So I think, for instance, photogravure is a large category of many different variations and many different names, but generally, photogravure is an agreed upon term. Does that make sense?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. I never actually took history of photo classes as an undergrad, which, well, shocking. That's what I did my PhD in. But I was wondering, this is like a theme of your talk, and I'm wondering if you could directly address how the history of photomechanical prints changes the history of photography as it's generally known.
I love that question, and I'm thinking about that all the time. And I know I'm not the only one. There are others and art historians that are actually interested in this topic, so they could probably speak a little bit better. But yeah, I think that there are many reasons, perhaps, why photomechanical was not originally included in the story of the history of photography. Clearly, I hope that I demonstrated that in early photography, it was very much seen to be the same thing. And many of the inventors that was the goal, was photomechanical printing. And then there was kind of this separation that got us to where we are now. Is that answering the question? Yeah. I think it's a very big question. It's also very philosophical. I think that there are many reasons that when photography was becoming accepted as art, the processes of photomechanical were kind of shifted to the side so that they would not be brought down. There was this distinction between process photography and art photography, and its acceptance into museums and into fine art, and I think that that is one reason. But this is very much a topic that I'm thinking about a lot, and it's not fully formed, but there's a lot there, and I hope that art history and the history of photography is at a moment right now, and I think that it is, where we are reconsidering and kind of pulling this back in as a very important part, especially to the early history of photography. Okay, one more question?
We can take it from the online audience.
Okay.
Is chemistry used for identification of print processes? Like, can you identify a platinum print with chemistry or only microscope viewing? And is that for protection of the object?
So yes, there are analytical methods that can be used for identification of photographic processes, and like the suggestion that was given, platinum, you could use XRF to identify that platinum is present, and that is commonly used for identifying photographic materials, chemical photographic materials. Not everyone has access to science and to analytical methods, so typically the first line of identification is through knowledgeable identification through viewing. Magnification is one way. You can also use different types of lighting to bring out different qualities of the print, and that is the kind of the first level of identification. But yes, if you have access to scientific departments and analytical methods, those are helpful. I'm thinking about how those can be used for photomechanical prints. It's not very often that they are useful because the end result is actually ink on paper, and there might be some distinctions between inks, but it's not as useful as for chemical photography. That's typically something that would be more useful for identification in chemical photography. So, Okay. Now, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.